Tutankhamun's spectacular treasures. Now, for the first time since they were discovered, all 5,398 objects are being brought together in a new $1 billion museum. This will be the first time many of them have been seen for a century.
Look at the horse, look at the horse, look at the horse.
Scientists have been using the latest imaging and forensic technology to unlock long-buried mysteries, to reveal the man behind the mask.
So many tiny details are visible again.
And one treasure has caused more speculation over the years than any other: Tutankhamun's death mask.
Some scholars have begun to suggest that this may not belong to him at all.
Now, who the mask was actually made for may no longer be a mystery. The Valley of the Kings, the sacred burial ground of ancient Egypt's pharaohs. For centuries, archaeologists have explored these tombs, but each one they entered was stripped bare by grave robbers in search of gold. Every tomb, except one. On November 26, 1922, archaeologist Howard Carter broke into that long-forgotten tomb to make the greatest archaeological discovery of all time. He found the breathtaking treasures of Tutankhamun. Ever since, the world has marveled at the royal splendor of this young king's tomb. And the most famous treasure of all is the death mask.
Tutankhamun's mask is an icon. And I think part of it is because it is made of solid gold, and a lot of people get wowed by that, as well as by the beauty of the craftsmanship and also by the elegance and the expression of the face.
Crafted from 22 pounds of gold, this priceless object is known throughout the world. But speculation has always swirled around this 3,000-year-old treasure, with some experts claiming the mask may never have been made for Tutankhamun. Now, the opening of a major new museum offers Egyptologists a unique opportunity to assess everything from the tomb as never before. And the world-famous death mask has undergone the most intensive forensic examination ever. It will answer once and for all if this is the mask of Tutankhamun. The Cairo Museum has been the home of the death mask ever since it was discovered a century ago.
Let's see how to open this.
And to see how the mask was documented when it was first discovered, Egyptologist Chris Naunton is stepping back in time.
Wow.
Hidden in the bowels of the museum is a 100-year-old book that details every single object found in Tutankhamun's tomb. It's Howard Carter's original excavation log.
Wow. This is it. This is the beginning of the record.
Yeah.
And so this is the first thing that he recorded. Shrine outermost.
Yeah.
6064. Can I turn the page?
These pages, barely turned for a century, reveal that over 5,000 objects were taken from the tomb, but only a third have ever been seen in public.
That's the death mask. What does he say? Mask of mummy, beard and necklace.
Yes.
Wow. There it is. The most famous archaeological object from the ancient world. Mask of mummy. 60672.
And now, decades after its discovery, the mask is about to start a new chapter in life. In a high-security operation, the entire contents of Tutankhamun's tomb are heading to a brand new home. 15 years in the making, and at a cost of $1 billion, the massive Grand Egyptian Museum is rising up in the desert outside Cairo. The huge array of items arriving show how much this young pharaoh took to the grave when he died at the age of 19.
Ideally, once you die, you go and live forever, and therefore you need everything that you needed in this life. And if you're a king, you had a lot of stuff. Fantastic. This is a scepter, which maybe he would have held, or maybe someone else would have walked before him with.
There's everything, from mummified food for the afterlife
Nice.
to the childhood belongings of the boy who became the head of a powerful empire when he was only 9.
This is some sort of a seat with a footstool. Little bottom of hut.
Yeah.
Aww. Sweet. He needed all of the stuff he used in daily life, but he also needed a lot of religious, magical things that would help him go from this world to the next. So this is why his tomb is just exploding with objects.
The most important of those magical objects was the death mask. This golden portrait, a clear likeness of Tutankhamun, was vital. It was how he would be recognized in the afterlife. As the thousands of burial goods, from the sacred to the mundane, are gathered together in the new museum, there's a chance for new information about all these objects to be uncovered.
Layers and layers and layers of information are coming out, not just because objects are being examined in detail, but also because new technologies can be applied to them.
Scientific advances beyond the wildest dreams of Howard Carter are allowing the contents of the tomb to be forensically examined, some for the first time. And what's become clearer is that Tutankhamun's massive royal burial did not go according to plan.
Perhaps things were not done exactly as they should have been. Perhaps they were done in a hurry.
The origin of some of the most magnificent objects in the tomb is in doubt. And some have now even suggested that the most famous of all the pharaoh's treasures, his death mask, may not have originally belonged to him.
Was the mask created for Tutankhamun or for someone else?
Could it be true that this iconic death mask was never intended for Tutankhamun? It's inlaid with thousands of fragments of colored glass and semi-precious stones. Lapis lazuli from Afghanistan fills the eyebrows. Red carnelian from India sets off the garland. And the eyes are formed from Turkish obsidian. According to ancient Egyptian burial law, this whole mask had to be ready in a startlingly short amount of time. Little more than 2 months was allowed from the moment of death until a body was sealed in its tomb. And that has raised doubts about the mask.
The priesthood and the craftsmen who were involved in preparing the burial equipment would only have had 70 days, and that's the length of time it takes to prepare the body for burial, in which to create material like this death mask. And some people would say that 70 days is not long enough to create an object as fine as this, in which case the only way it could have ended up among the burial equipment of Tutankhamun was if it was already available. perhaps having been made for somebody else.
Over recent years, speculation has mounted that the death mask originally belonged to Tutankhamun's stepmother, Nefertiti. People have wondered if craftsmen short of time could have rescued her mask and replaced her face with that of Tutankhamun. At the new Grand Egyptian Museum, the sheer number of objects arriving in its storerooms seems to add weight to this theory. It was a huge task for the ancient Egyptians to prepare a king's tomb.
Just incredible to think that these things are so old, they're so fragile. I mean, the detail on this is absolutely exquisite. If you look at the open work in this model shrine with the detail of a bull, it's intimidating to be this close to it almost.
The volumes are staggering. Hundreds of arrows, beds, sticks, even shoes.
These are
the
beautiful. Yeah.
smallest we have.
So these must have been sandals made for Tutankhamun when he was
Yes.
a young child.
Yes.
How many sandals do we have all together? How many pairs do you know?
All we received until now is about 30.
30 pairs already here,
Yes.
and there's still more coming.
Yes.
That's amazing. Many of these objects have never come out of storage. They've never seen the light of day. And it's only now, therefore, that we can really get a sense of the full extent of the treasures that Tutankhamun was buried with. And it's really incredible to think. I mean, every single one of these items is an exquisite work of art in its own right.
And all of these thousands of objects had to be either found or created from scratch in just 2 months before being transported to the tomb. Tutankhamun's burial site lies 400 miles south of Cairo's Grand Egyptian Museum, in the Valley of the Kings. Chris Naunton has come to these desert hills to see where all the treasures from Tutankhamun's tomb were first gathered over 3,000 years ago. They lay here until the archaeologist Howard Carter first discovered the long hidden entrance to the young pharaoh's tomb.
Even though I must have been here dozens of times now, it's still a thrill to come down that descending passageway every time. And it's difficult not to try to imagine what it must have been like for Howard Carter coming into this tomb, finding it absolutely chock full of this incredible assemblage of material of the finest quality, more or less exactly as it had been left 3,000 years ago.
The tomb was so full, it took Carter and his team 10 years to remove the massive treasures and haul them across the desert back to Cairo. But as the excavation progressed, Carter was hampered by the size of the site. The burial chamber was so cramped, the team could barely fit around the gilded shrines. It was soon clear this was an unusual tomb for such a powerful ruler of ancient Egypt.
I've got to escape the feeling that all is not quite right here. It's just not very big and it's just not very complicated. The design is really quite simple. There's not very much wall space at all. And what there is only half decorated. It feels more here as though a space has been hastily adapted to receive the burial of a pharaoh.
The fact that Tutankhamun's tomb is so small and badly prepared has long puzzled Egyptologists. And at the Grand Egyptian Museum, there's evidence that Tutankhamun's burial fell short in other ways. The latest shipment of objects from the tomb has arrived. It's a batch of shabtis, models of servants intended to serve the pharaoh after death. There were more than 400 of these small figures, many of which have never been displayed before. Each one should look like Tutankhamun, bearing the same face as his death mask.
It's funny with the googly eyes.
But they've raised questions for Egyptologist Salima Ikram.
The idea is that these should all look like Tutankhamun, but you can clearly see a lot of variety here. So although the paint job's similar, the faces are very different because that one's got a pointy nose and that one's got a differently shaped mouth. Some faces are more delicately formed and slightly more feminine even than his. Others are a bit more robust. So there is a question as to whether some of them might be made for someone else.
It seems the leader of an ancient empire may have been buried with objects never intended for him.
You do see reuse in tomb material fairly frequently, especially in the non-royal corpus. But it seems a bit odd to do this in a royal burial.
The conservators at the Grand Egyptian Museum are now trying to establish how much of Tutankhamun's burial treasure originally belonged to someone else. Existing estimates are staggering. Over 1,000 items, a quarter of the contents of the tomb, are second-hand.
At this point, it's very difficult to be precise about how many items might have been made for someone else, and he used, because it's only now that we are looking even more closely at these artifacts, and so we are slowly coming into the process of saying, well, this might belong to someone else, and it clearly belongs to someone else. So we really have to look at each object individually and very carefully.
It seems the tomb workers, pressed for time, reused items to boost Tutankhamun's store of treasures for the afterlife. That backs up evidence already gathered of what seems like a botched burial. Away from Cairo, at the Griffith Institute in Oxford, England, there are more clues that shortcuts were taken in putting together Tutankhamun's tomb. Chris Naunton has come to study the original notes Howard Carter made as he first assessed the king's burial chamber.
It's absolutely incredible drawing, which was made by Carter himself, is a kind of a plan view of the assemblage of shrines, sarcophagus, and coffins that were found in the burial chamber in the tomb.
Carter carefully noted how Tutankhamun's body, bearing his death mask, was interred in 3 coffins, placed one inside the other, like Russian dolls. The coffins were then encased in a stone sarcophagus inside a set of gilded shrines. In theory, they should have fit perfectly inside one another, but Carter found otherwise.
When he had removed the coffins from inside the sarcophagus, he began to notice that something wasn't quite right. And as he says here, the top edge of the feet of the lid had been chipped away in places, they being too high to allow the lid of the sarcophagus to be placed on the sarcophagus. It seems the coffin was too big for the sarcophagus and it wasn't possible to place the lid down. Carter was beginning to record these anomalies and to recognize that there was something a little bit strange about the way this had been put together.
Tutankhamun, the head of a powerful empire, was given an undersized sarcophagus that couldn't hold his outer coffin. And the middle coffin raises more questions. Discrepancies on the coffin's nameplate, or cartouche, have intrigued Egyptologist Aidan Dodson. He suggests Tutankhamun wasn't just surrounded by second-hand possessions. He was even buried in someone else's coffin.
First of all, the middle coffin is heavily inlaid in glass, completely unlike the other two, which are basically a pure gold appearance. Second, there's some of the inscriptions have the cartouche of the king, which is sunk a little bit too deep into the surface than one would have expected. It looks like the original cartouche has been cut out and a new one inserted. And the final thing is the face, which is not the face of Tutankhamun at all. The cheeks are much wider, and it's also the jaw is rather squarer as well. A much more slightly more pugnacious looking individual.
It seems the second coffin, one of the most important items in the tomb, may have been recycled. It had someone else's face on it. And this isn't a one-off. Even the precious gold bands used to bind Tutankhamun's mummified body show signs of another name. Chris Naunton has a rare opportunity to see if he can identify who before these bands are moved to the new museum.
I've never seen the underside of this band before, but what's really striking straight away as soon as it's been turned over is that there are cartouches on this side which are not present on the other side. It's quite difficult to read in this light, and I'm looking at the inscription side on, but I can see a scarab beetle and 3 plural strokes, and I think next to the scarab beetle there is an ankh sign, which is a kind of a loop and then a little sort of cross underneath. We sometimes know it as the key of life, in which case this is the name Ankhesenamun, which is one of the names used by a pharaoh about whom we know very little, but it's definitely not Tutankhamun.
Yet again, one of Tutankhamun's most personal burial goods is taken from a previous pharaoh. The evidence is coming together. Tutankhamun was interred in an undersized tomb, and many of his other burial goods, now being examined at the Grand Egyptian Museum, were reused. The case for the iconic death mask being recycled is getting stronger. Now, experts are searching for the final proof. Cairo, the home of Tutankhamun's death mask since its discovery. For a century, the mask has been drawing admirers from around the world. But recently, speculation about the true origins of the mask has become increasingly intense.
In the last couple of years, some scholars have begun to suggest that actually this may not belong to him at all, or it may not originally have been made for Tutankhamun. And there are several reasons for thinking this. First of all, the gold that was used to model the face, and we're sure this is the face of Tutankhamun, is of a different caliber from the gold that's used in the rest of the mask, as if the face was modeled separately, perhaps at a later time.
The theory that the original face of the mask was cut out and replaced by a portrait of Tutankhamun has gained popularity. And Egyptologists have noticed other signs that could show the mask is secondhand.
The cartouche, which includes the hieroglyphic signs which spell out the name Tutankhamun, seems to have been altered, as if perhaps originally it read a different name, a name that was not that of Tutankhamun.
Queen Nefertiti is thought to be the likely previous owner of the mask. Yet all the theories about the true origins of the mask have remained no more than speculation. Until now. In a recent groundbreaking development, leading conservator Christian Ekman gained the opportunity to study this 3,000-year-old treasure. It was the first time that permission had been granted to examine the mask in such depth.
Being entrusted with such a wonderful job also means a great responsibility. It's a unique chance, to study such an iconic object, and of course, the pressure you have is not the pressure which is put by others on you, but the own pressure. You want to achieve the best results, and it's really a single opportunity in lifetime.
While Christian Ekman's work should definitively settle the origin of the death mask, researchers at the new museum have been digging into some of the other puzzles from the tomb. Even objects specifically made for the pharaoh seem to have problems. Museum director Tarek Taufik has been inspecting one of Tutankhamun's gilded ceremonial beds that has recently arrived at the museum.
When working on it, one has discovered that there are different signs on the bed. These signs have started a vivid discussion between Egyptologists about how these beds were assembled.
It's believed the inscriptions on the base of the cow bed refer to the lion god, which suggests that parts from two different beds were mixed up by workers in the tomb.
They had to deal with the situation that the corridor leading to the tomb of Tutankhamun was quite narrow. So the pieces had to be disassembled and then reassembled inside the tomb. Should the beds have been assembled incorrectly, this would tell us that the people were under time pressure. This might have led to mistakes.
It's further evidence the tomb workers were battling against the clock. But why does Tutankhamun's burial seem so much more hurried than that of other pharaohs? Away from the museum, Chris Naunton wants to see if Tutankhamun's body can provide an answer. The pharaoh's mummy, wearing its golden death mask, was first revealed when Howard Carter opened the inner coffin. It took him 3 years of painstaking excavation to reach this point, and he was shocked at what he found.
No Egyptian should have been mummified like this, let alone an Egyptian pharaoh. It was quite normal for there to be an incision on the torso, which would have allowed the removal of the internal organs, which is a part of the mummification process. But in this case, that incision is much too big and it's in the wrong place as well. And also, most unusually of all, perhaps, the heart, which wasn't one of the organs that should have been removed. It was essential that that remained inside the body. This had been removed in the case of Tutankhamun's mummy. So clearly, this was not a standard mummification.
The labs at the museum are steadily filling with more and more artifacts from ancient Egypt. Yet no other mummy in the collection has been found without a heart. It was seen as the center of intelligence and emotion, and essential to life after death. Without his heart, Tutankhamun would have been sent into eternity, unable to think or feel. Clues to why Tutankhamun was buried without his heart could be resting in the body of the ancient nobleman, Yuya.
He's amazing. This is why some of us do Egyptology, because, I mean, you actually get to see them and know them in a much more intimate and personal way, and it is extraordinarily moving.
Yuya was the great-grandfather of Tutankhamun, and his perfectly kept mummy is in stark contrast to the young king.
You can see how beautifully he's preserved, and although his skin is darkened by oils and resins, it's nothing like the body of Tutankhamun, which is glooped over with masses of resin and oil. It is a very nice counterpoint in comparison with Tutankhamun. And now, Mr. Momin, maybe we can see how that evisceration cut.
Like most ancient Egyptian bodies, Yuya has a slit at the side of his abdomen.
There we go. That's what we want to see. This is the evisceration cut, and from here, the embalmer would put in his hand and pull out the internal organs. So this is a normal incision, which is over the left flank. But Tutankhamun had a completely odd incision that went straight from the belly button out in a sort of diagonal, which no one else has. And so then his internal organs were removed, higgledy-piggledy, possibly including the heart.
Tutankhamun's botched mummification has led Egyptologists to speculate where and how he died. If he died suddenly, away from home, it could have taken weeks to bring his body back to the Valley of the Kings.
This could mean that he was mummified somewhere away from the Nile Valley in an unexpected way because he didn't have any experts with him who really knew what they were doing.
Because Tutankhamun died young at age 19, it's likely preparations had not been made for his burial. And that meant there would have been much less time than usual to create his death mask and gather together his thousands of burial goods. The man in charge of where and how the young king was buried was his successor, the pharaoh I. And his tomb in the Valley of the Kings is in sharp contrast to the burial site he chose for Tutankhamun.
One thing that strikes you straight away, in contrast to the tomb of Tutankhamun, is that in all aspects, this tomb is just grander, it's bigger. Those passageways are wider. It makes much more of a sort of a grand spectacle of the sarcophagus in the center here. This feels very much like the burial chamber that would be fit for a pharaoh. It's the right size, the decorative elements are here, the care and attention spent on that decoration by the painters is really obvious. The scene of Pharaoh hunting in the marshes is very striking for its detail and particularly the beautiful way in which the birds are painted.
Tutankhamun's tomb is half the size of I's, much smaller than most other royal burial sites in the Valley of the Kings.
It was absolutely standard for pharaohs to begin construction of their tombs more or less as soon as they began their reign. And so for Tutankhamun, he would have had a tomb underway, and he might well have had ideas about what he would have wanted.
I's tomb has the grandeur that Tutankhamun would have expected. So why was Tutankhamun's burial site so small and his funeral so lacking in care?
People have suggested that this tomb was originally being prepared for Tutankhamun, but it was usurped by I as part of his power grab, if you like, when there was a vacuum and a vacancy on the throne at the end of Tut's reign.
Tutankhamun died without heirs. It seems likely that a high-ranking official, but not a member of the royal family, took his chance to seize power. He may have usurped the dead king's tomb and forced him into an undersized burial site with goods taken from previous pharaohs. Now, new scientific tests can tell us if I inflicted one final indignity on Tutankhamun. Did he send the young pharaoh to his grave in a borrowed death mask? The Egyptian Museum in Cairo. The dark halls will soon be emptied of their treasures as the antiquities are transferred to the new Grand Egyptian Museum. And the last piece from Tutankhamun's collection to be moved will be the iconic death mask, one of the most revered objects in the world.
Face to face.
Since 2015, leading conservator Christian Ekman has carried out an intensive investigation of the mask.
Have you seen that? Within the eye, left and right, they have painted tiny veins which make the whole eye so lifelike. It's the attention to details I love so much.
His privileged access is allowing him to piece together exactly how the mask was made before it's moved to the new museum. For the first time, expert analysis can answer the question that's been hanging over the mask for years. Was it made for Tutankhamun or someone else? Ekman started by studying the controversial nameplate, or cartouche.
So we are looking here at the royal cartouche of the mask of Tutankhamun, which is placed near the shoulder on the left side of the mask. And in fact, you see some suspicious or unusual traces, like the line here, this one here, which cannot be interpreted so easily.
It's been suggested these marks show Tutankhamun's name was engraved over the top of another name, that of his stepmother, Queen Nefertiti. But Ekman's research points in a different direction.
One has to understand you cannot create a mask of this size without connecting different gold sheets together to the whole mask itself. And the cartouche is running over two parts of gold sheets which have been connected exactly in this position or joined together. And that is what you see here, one of those seams.
The supposedly reworked cartouche is simply evidence of parts of the mask being joined together. But there's something else that's puzzled some Egyptologists for the last few years. The color of the gold in the face is different from the rest of the mask. One theory that's gained traction is the suggestion that the huge time pressure caused by the young king's sudden death meant the craftsmen had to cut corners. So they inserted a portrait of Tutankhamun into something previously made. As part of his investigation, Christian used a powerful X-ray known as XRF to analyze the content of the gold. He wanted to see if the various parts of the mask came from different sources.
We measured more than 100 dots or points all over the mask. The result was clear. They used many sheets of the same gold composition. That also includes the face. So it looks to me very unlikely that the face could have been changed in antiquity and replaced.
Ekman proved that every part of the mask was made from the same gold. That strongly suggests the entire mask was made at the same time, but using different techniques to give the gold a variety of colors. And Ekman found other evidence that the mask is a one-off original. Clues that came from the stone and glass inlays around the face.
If the face would have been cut out and replaced after the mask has been finished already, it could not have been soldered in again without damaging or even destroying the glass inlays nearby, because they cannot stand such high temperatures. I personally think this mask was for Tutankhamun. It was designed for him and it was used for him.
Ekman's results seem to be definitive and mark the end of years of controversy. Tutankhamun's fabulous death mask was made for him alone in just 70 days. An astonishing feat for ancient Egyptian craftsmen.
It is one of the most beautiful portraits in the world. And from the point of view of a conservator studying technology, it's really impressive to see what they were able to do. I would doubt that someone today could create such a masterpiece, and it's really important to know in such a short time.
Tutankhamun was laid to rest wearing a death mask made for him alone. Despite his rushed funeral and less than royal tomb. Now the mask will take center stage at the Grand Egyptian Museum. and a new, imposing mausoleum to the young pharaoh will be created. The mask and the treasures of his tomb will ensure Tutankhamun remains known throughout the world.
It's my privilege to work so closely with these pieces and to feel that we are coming so close to 3,500 years of history. It's like touching Tutankhamun. The touch that will keep it for generations to come.
More than 3,000 years ago, a young pharaoh was hurriedly buried in a small tomb, surrounded by borrowed goods, in the hope that his memory would soon be forgotten. But in a final irony, it was Tutankhamun's humble tomb that allowed the treasures crowned by his golden death mask to lie unnoticed until their discovery thousands of years later.
Cigarette lighter. That face, which we know so well from the tomb of Tut, is here everywhere. Little statues, some T-shirts, some little jars, these silver plates, everywhere you look.
And his golden death mask has made Tutankhamun's face the best known of any person from the ancient world.
Okay, wow. So that's yeah, okay, so it's kind of Tutankhamun's death mask on a sort of neoclassical column. That's pretty crazy. Every Egyptian wanted to be remembered. They wanted their name to live on. Maybe it was too much for most of them to ask for their face to be remembered. But in the case of King Tut, this is an overwhelming success. It's very beautifully done. Tutankhamun would be pleased about this. Yeah. He'll be very pleased about this one. Thank you so much. Thank you very much. Very good doing business with you. Thank you. You have a beautiful shop.
Yes, thank you.
The treasures of his tomb catapulted the young pharaoh into more fame than he could have ever imagined. Tutankhamun may have been buried to be forgotten, but instead, his memory is destined to live forever.